The fact of your own existence is the most astonishing fact you'll ever have to confront. Don't you ever dare say that life is boring, monotonous, or joyless. One way to express this is the improbability of your personal existence. Of course, with hindsight, the probability of your personal existence is 1, since you exist. But that's the hindsight of a lottery winner after he's won the lottery. The probability of winning a big lottery before you go into it is so close to 0 as to render it an irrational decision to enter. Unless, which is not totally irrational, you gain measurable happiness from a forlorn flicker of hope. I suppose I don't really need to spell out the a priori improbability of your own personal existence. Your parents not only had to meet, they had to copulate on a particular occasion. A particular sperm had to penetrate a particular egg. And even that wasn't enough to assure your personal identity. As we can see from the paradox that after the fertilized egg that was you formed, it might have split to give rise to 2 identical twins. And I can't quite get my head around the question of whether, if that had happened, one of those twins would have been you, and if so, which one? That all the same conditions had to be met for your grandparents, your great-grandparents, all your grandsesters, to coin a word, back through shrews, synapsid reptiles, fish, back to the origin of life itself. And this way of thinking makes it inescapable that a quite preposterously large list of lucky contingencies had to be met in order for you to exist. As I put it before, if the 3rd dinosaur to the left of the tall cycad tree had not happened to sneeze at exactly the moment when he did, your umpteenth great-grandparents would never have met. And we can say the same for the existence of every species, every genus, of the mammals, of the mollusks, everything. The following is a definite fact. Once upon a time, there was a species of animal, more than 500 million years ago. There was a species of animal, a population which split in 2. One half was destined to give rise to us, and the other half was destined to give rise to the octopuses. When I say us, I mean, of course, us and all the other half of the animal kingdom to which we belong. When I say octopuses, I mean the half of the animal kingdom to which they belong. But we once were part of the same species. And once again, it was a lucky accident that the splitting of that species happened to take place, some kind of geographical separation on opposite sides of some long-forgotten reef. I don't know what it would have been. Nobody knows what it would have been. But we do know that some such accident happened, and as a result, the mollusks are here, the vertebrates are here. And you can say the same thing of all the animals and all the plants. So, emphasizing the luck of our being here and the luck of every group of animals being here raises a danger of a grave misunderstanding which I must forestall, and forestalling it gives me the opportunity to emphasize even more strongly how wondrous the world is, rather than dull or arid or joyless. And this misunderstanding is this: with so much chance, so much luck, so much contingency, you might be tempted to think that evolution itself is a process of pure chance. And the exact opposite is the case. Nothing could be further from the truth. It may be chance that particular species are here, particular individuals are here, but it is very much not chance that some kind of species would be here. It's very much not chance that there would be herbivores eating plants, plants getting nourishment from the sun, carnivores eating herbivores, parasites eating everybody. So I want to contrast 2 opposite lessons from this initial part of my talk. We have 2 pieces of good fortune. There's the extreme randomness and luck, the contingency of our individual existence and the existence of the particular groups to which we belong. But on the other hand, we have an extreme predictability of the evolutionary process itself. The evolutionary process itself, once it got started, was highly predictable in the manner that I've just described. Your neighbouring island of Australia is a beautiful place in which to illustrate this, because Australia has a mammal fauna which evolved independently of the rest of the world during the same period that the rest of the world's mammals were evolving. This was after the splitting of the great southern continent of Gondwana, which you remember split into Africa, South America, Australia, Antarctica, New Zealand, Madagascar, and India. And after that split, which happened roughly the same time as straight after the dinosaurs went extinct, after that split, the mammals evolved, not in New Zealand, where birds, interestingly, filled the shoes of mammals, but in those other continents, mammals evolved independently. We have a beautiful natural experiment of the independent evolution of the mammals. And what is so striking about that is not just the differences, but the similarities. There is a predictable force tugging evolution in particular directions, in the directions of filling the niches that are available. In the same kind of way, in the case of the mammals, the same kind of way as the dinosaurs filled those same niches before them. And before the dinosaurs, the so-called mammal-like reptiles filled them. Comparative analysis shows that eyes have evolved independently some dozens of times. So it's predictable that if you were to rerun evolution, say starting once again from perhaps not the origin of life, but say the origin of multicellular life, it is predictable that eyes would evolve, probably the same sorts of eyes, camera eyes, compound eyes, maybe even parabolic reflector eyes, for we have them in scallops. Ears would evolve. Predictably, you will expect ears to evolve. Maybe they'd be different in detail, but some sort of organs for sensing sounds and brains for analyzing sounds. In particular, echolocation, the trick that's used not just by bats, but by whales, toothed whales as well, and by two independent groups of birds using echoes to find their way around, using the same trick as humans much later discovered and called sonar. So we can predict that once again, if we run the tape of evolution again, that idea was first put forward by the American biologist Stuart Kauffman. If we could run the tape of evolution again, we would predict that we would get echolocation. We predict that we would get hearts and kidneys and nervous systems. I don't know how many times the nervous system has evolved, but we can say that enlargements of the nervous system that could be called brains have evolved in several different invertebrate groups as well as vertebrates, and big brains big enough to be plausibly conscious have evolved several times within the vertebrates at least, certainly in primates, which is our group, in whales, in carnivores, in elephants, and probably in some others. Simon Conway Morris, the Cambridge paleontologist, has speculated that if we ran the tape of evolution again, we would get humans again. Most people think he's gone too far there, but I think not much too far. He's certainly gone too far in thinking that buttresses his own Christian beliefs. But the idea that if you ran the tape of evolution again, you would probably get some kind of bipedal, big-brained creature with stereoscopic vision looking forwards and with grasping, skillful hands. That's not a very strong prediction in my view, but it wouldn't be terribly surprising if it happened twice. So we have two opposite reasons to give thanks for being alive. Contingency, sheer luck on the one hand, and the predictability of evolution on the other. Among the improbable contingencies for which we have to give thanks are some that were necessary, that had to happen in order for the predictable process of evolution to get going. Once evolution gets going, it is predictable in the special sense that I've identified. But the origin of evolution was probably one of those one-off events, one of those one-shot events that only had to happen once and could have been, I don't know that it was, but could have been very, very improbable indeed. Natural selection is the great engine of the predictable side of life. But the engine of predictability, which is evolution by natural selection, cannot start without certain prerequisites, at least some of which I think belong on the sheer good luck side of the ledger. In particular, of course, the origin of life itself. More precisely, the origin of some sort of self-replicating entity, some sort of molecule that was capable of making copies of itself, accurate copies of itself. They have to be very accurate. That accident only had to happen once. Once that had happened, then the predictable engine of natural selection could take over. We don't know whether life originated more than once. It could have done. We do know that every form of life that we've looked at, every surviving form of life that's ever been examined, is descended from one origin. And we know that because the genetic code, the code by which DNA letters are translated into, the 4-letter code of DNA is translated into the 20-letter code of polypeptide chains of proteins, that code is universal, almost entirely accurately universal. And that cannot have come about by anything other than luck. It must, well, I won't use the word luck there. That cannot have come about more than once. It's got to mean that everything is descended from the same common ancestor. If there were other origins of life giving rise to perhaps some alternative kind of bacteria, then they've gone. Or we've never discovered them. The British-Australian physicist Paul Davies has speculated that it might be worth looking for alternative origins of life, looking for some kind of bacteria-like creatures that don't use the DNA code or use a different DNA code. I think the hope is somewhat forlorn. I think that Paul Davies himself recognizes that it's somewhat forlorn. But since it's so difficult to get to other planets to look for life there, Davies suggests that we might profitably employ ourselves looking for it here, rather on the principle that when you've lost your keys, even if you didn't lose them under the lamppost, you look under the lamppost because that's the only place where there's any light to find them. The system, the DNA protein system, which is the only biochemical system we know, is a high-tech system. And it probably had a forerunner, which we don't see anymore, and we don't know what that forerunner was. Nobody knows what happened in the origin of life, but we do know a lot about how the present system works. It's universal, the DNA protein system. And I want to say a little bit about that. DNA is exceedingly good at getting itself accurately copied. That's what its speciality is. Protein needs DNA in order to be synthesized. Protein is no good at making copies of itself. You can't copy a protein molecule, and the reason is that protein molecules are tied up in knots. This at least is one sufficient reason. A protein molecule is tied up in knots, and therefore the sequence of amino acids, which is a protein molecule, is not accessible. DNA is in long strips, long threads, and therefore the sequence is available for templates, for copying. So DNA is an expert copier, protein is an expert enzyme. It's an expert catalyst. It is protein which is the executive branch of the biochemical enterprise. It is protein which determines which chemical reactions happen, and that determines most of what happens that matters in life. I'm going to read a passage from The Greatest Show on Earth, which is my attempt to understand the role of enzymes, of catalysts, proteins, in the chemistry of life. A chemistry lab has hundreds of bottles and jars on its shelves, each containing a different pure substance, compounds and elements, solutions and powders. A chemist wishing to perform a certain chemical reaction selects 2 or 3 bottles, takes a sample from each, mixes them in a test tube or a flask, perhaps applies heat, and the reaction takes place. Other chemical reactions that could take place in the lab don't, because the glass walls of the bottles and jars prevent the ingredients meeting. If you want a different chemical reaction, you mix different ingredients in a different flask. Everywhere there are glass barriers keeping the pure substances separate from one another in bottles or jars, and keeping the reacting combinations separate from one another in test tubes or flasks or beakers. The living cell, too, is a great chemistry lab, and it has a similarly large store of chemicals. But they aren't kept in separate bottles and jars on shelves. They're all mixed up together. It's as though a vandal, a chemical lord of misrule, entered the lab, seized all the bottles on all the shelves, and tipped them with anarchistic abandon into one great cauldron. Terrible thing to do. Well, it would be if they all reacted together in all possible combinations, but they don't. Or if they do, the rate at which they react together is so slow that they might as well not be reacting at all. Except, and this is the whole point, if an enzyme is present. There's no need for glass bottles and jars to keep the substances apart, because to all intents and purposes, they're not going to react together anyway, unless the right enzyme is present. The equivalent of keeping the chemicals in stoppered bottles until you want to mix a particular pair, say A and B, is to mix all the hundreds of substances up in a great witch's brew, but supply only the right enzyme to catalyze the reaction between A and B, and no other combination. So the chemistry of the living cell works in a very different way from the chemistry in a chemistry lab. Everything is present, and the specificity, the selectivity by which this chemical reaction occurs and no other is achieved by a particular enzyme being present. And why is that particular enzyme present? Because the gene that makes it, the gene that specifies it, is turned on. And why is that gene turned on? All the genes are present in every cell of the body. It's turned on because some other gene, some other interaction between genes has turned it on. So there's a detailed, delicate control of the chemistry of the cell, which is ultimately achieved by genes. And it's genes that are selected by natural selection. It's genes that either survive or don't survive in the gene pool of a species. And the reason why they survive or don't survive is that they're good at building bodies. The ones that are good at building bodies are the ones that make it through into the next generation and into the next and into the next. So the world becomes full of genes that are good at making bodies, and the world becomes full of bodies that are made by good genes. The process by which this happens is unconscious, automatic. It's a process of chemistry going on in cells, supervised by enzymes, supervised by genes. The chemistry of the cell influences the behavior of the cell in relation to neighboring cells in the developing embryo. Sheets of tissue in the embryo fold and buckle, invaginate, stretch, grow, sometimes die. And it's those processes that shape the developing embryo and turn it into an elephant or a human or a flea or a hippo. The difference is the genes that are inherited down the generations. So natural selection is the automatic process whereby some genes survive in gene pools and others don't, and the reason they survive is that they exert this chemical influence on cells via proteins, and the chemical influence on cells exerts a physical influence on embryonic processes, and the result is an elephant or a hippo or a flea. And if the elephant is a good elephant, what that means is that it will survive long enough in whatever way the species does, in the case of elephants by eating trees and so on, eating leaves, survive long enough and then be attractive enough to the opposite sex, whatever it takes in that species to mate and pass on the genes that did it all. Now, I've said that the origin of the whole thing, the origin of the first self-replicating entity, was probably one of those things that belongs on the extreme good luck side of the ledger. But how lucky was it? How extreme was it? We could imagine a spectrum, a continuum, from extreme luck on the one hand to only slightly lucky on the other. And that spectrum, that distinction, is tantamount to the distinction between life existing on only one planet and life existing on lots of different planets. The number of planets in the universe is of the order of billions of billions. It is conceivable that on only one planet in the entire universe did life arise. It is conceivable that the event, the lucky event, which is the origin of life, is so rare, so lucky, so improbable, that literally only one planet in the entire universe has life. My gut feeling is that that is not the case. My gut feeling, for what it's worth, which is virtually nothing, is that actually there's rather a lot of life around the universe, although my gut feeling is that because the number of planets in the universe is so vast, there can still be a lot of life in the universe, and yet the islands of life may be so spread out that each island never has a chance of ever encountering or even knowing about any of the others. As I say, we don't know whether, we don't know how lucky the origin of life, how lucky an event the origin of life was. But I just want to point out to you, and this is no longer gut feeling, this is now pure logic, that if you're one of those people who wants to think, whose gut feeling, in other words, is that we are unique, that we are the only form of life in the universe, then it necessarily follows that the origin of life on this planet was such an improbable event that we are totally and utterly wasting our time trying to speculate about how it happened. Now, that's a very paradoxical conclusion. What it means is that we are not looking for a plausible theory of the origin of life. We are looking for a desperately implausible theory. Because if there was a plausible theory of the origin of life, then it would follow that life must have arisen many times around the universe. And maybe it has. All I'm saying is that if you're one of those who wants to believe that life on this planet is unique, then you have to cope with that rather remarkable consequence, that our theory of the origin of life, our theory of the chemical events that had to take place to give rise to the first self-replicating entity, must be a very, very, very improbable, implausible event. So improbable as to count as impossible under the ordinary, everyday, common sense definition. Not literally impossible because it happened at least once. But now let's go back to the earlier event, which would be the origin of the universe and the laws of physics, because that also might qualify as one of those extreme strokes of luck that had to happen in order for what I call the engine of predictability, evolution, to get going. There are physicists who tell us, on good authority, that the laws and constants of physics are almost too good to be true. For example, Martin Rees, the present Astronomer Royal and President of the Royal Society of London, has written a nice book called Just 6 Numbers, in which he draws attention to 6 of the physical fundamental constants. Now, these are 6 numbers. They're things like the gravitational constant, the constant which specifies the strength of the weak force, and so on. These 6 numbers are known to physicists. They know what the value of them is to great precision, but they don't know why they have those values. They have plenty of theories that use those numbers in building castles of theories, but they have no idea why those numbers are there. They're just there. And Rees and other physicists have calculated what would happen if any of these 6 numbers were ever so slightly different in value. You could think of them as being 6 knobs that you can twiddle, that some godlike being at the beginning of the universe had it in his power to twiddle these 6 knobs and fine-tune them to exactly some particular value. And if any one of those knobs had been turned to a slightly different value, the universe as we know it wouldn't have happened, life would have been impossible. For example, if the gravitational constant had been different, there would be no galaxies. Matter in the universe would just be evenly spread through the universe. There'd be no galaxies, there'd be no stars. If there were no stars, there would be no chemistry, because you need big stars in order to forge in the interior of the stars, to forge the elements, any elements heavier than hydrogen. So there would be no chemistry, and you can't have life without chemistry. And you could do the same trick with each one of those 6 numbers. So this looks as though this is another one for the good luck side of the ledger. We need those 6 numbers to be exactly fine-tuned to precisely the right values, or we wouldn't be here. How are we going to cope with this? Well, other physicists, such as the American physicist Victor Stenger, denies the premise that these knobs are fine-tuned. And one of the arguments he puts forward is that it may be true that if you calculate what happens if you leave 5 of the knobs in the same place and then mentally twiddle the 6th one, then it is indeed necessary that it be very highly tuned, and the same for each one of them separately. But what if you allow yourself to twiddle them simultaneously, 2 or 3 of them simultaneously? That opens up a whole new raft of possible universes, which are much harder to calculate. And so it may be that the fine-tuning, the apparent fine-tuning of the fundamental constants as we've measured them, is an illusion. But plenty of physicists don't take that line and believe that there really is a fine-tuning effect. So, what are we going to make of that? Well, one thing we're not going to make of it is to conclude that if they're fine-tuned, there must have been a divine tuner, a supernatural knob twiddler. And that's very clear to see, because you can quickly see that that idea doesn't explain anything. Our whole problem is to explain how it comes about that these 6 numbers have exactly the right values. And the problem with that is it's very improbable, because you can theoretically imagine each knob having a whole range of different values. And so the chance of hitting on exactly the right value for all 6 is very, very low. That's the problem that faces us. And it's exactly the same problem that faces us if we postulate a divine knob twiddler, because he's got to know what value those 6 knobs have. And it's just as improbable to postulate a divine intelligence who knows what the values of the 6 knobs are as to postulate that somehow the 6 knobs just happened. They're equally improbable. So that theory will not wash. It won't do. Third possibility is to invoke the so-called anthropic principle. The anthropic principle states that all observable universes must have whatever properties are conducive to life, otherwise there would be nobody to observe them. So it's a rather paradoxical point, but it's kind of strictly valid. If a universe is observable, that means somebody's observing it, and nobody is observing any universe that doesn't have its fundamental constants tuned to the right values to bring life into being. But although there's a kind of logic to that, it's sort of rather unsatisfying. You sort of feel, well, it still leaves unexplained why they were fine-tuned. And so what Martin Rees and other physicists have added to that is the multiverse theory, which is a theory that arises out of other branches of physics, notably the currently fashionable inflationary model of the universe. According to the multiverse theory, the universe that we are in is just one bubble in a great foam of universes. And one version of the theory says that universes give rise to baby universes in some event, such as a black hole. So universes give birth to daughter universes in a kind of cosmic parthenogenesis. And at each birth event, the new universe that comes into being has different values of its fundamental constants. So we have billions of universes, all coexisting but mutually incommunicable, and they all have different values of their fundamental constants. As it were, their knobs are tuned perhaps at random in some other way. Now the anthropic principle really kicks in, because if there are billions of universes in the megaverse, in the multiverse, then since we are observing a universe, since we are sitting here thinking about it, we have to be in one of that tiny minority of universes that has the right constants, that has the right physical laws for us to be here. So that's actually quite a satisfying theory, at least I find it so. Not everybody does. There's something rather Darwinian about it. Maybe that's why I find it fascinating. It's not quite Darwinian natural selection, but there's an element of selection about it. In a way, our very presence selects for the universe that we're in because we're observing it. There's another version, an even more Darwinian version of that theory, which is that of the American physicist Lee Smolin. And this really is Darwinian. He wrote this up in his book, The Life of the Cosmos, in which he proposes that not only do universes give birth to daughter universes in black holes, but the fundamental constants don't just change at random, they change only slightly. Now that's much more like a genetic mutation. What that means is that you could actually have an evolutionary progression. Universes get better at making baby universes. Why would they get better? Because they have what it takes to get better, because they have the right values of the fundamental constants. What might those right values be? Well, they'd be whatever it takes to make black holes, say. That means they've got to last long enough to give birth to baby universes. They've got to have whatever properties it takes to make galaxies and stars, because you don't get black holes without galaxies and stars, that kind of thing. Now, incidentally, those happen to be the properties that you need to make life as well. You happen to be the properties that you need to make chemistry. So Smolin's idea is that there's a kind of Darwinian progression of universes whereby their fundamental constants evolve to become better, not only at making baby universes, but incidentally, as a kind of spin-off, better at making the conditions for the eventual evolution of life, what I've called the predictable engine. Well, Smolin's theory has not found favour with many physicists, but it's hard to find a strong objection to it, and he maintains that it's testable, which is the criterion scientists always seek in their theories. So, a combination of one-shot mega luck in the origin of the universe and the origin of life, together with the repeated predictable process of evolution by natural selection, has conspired to put us here, in a position to observe, in a position to give thanks for our luck in being here. Give thanks? Give thanks to whom or to what? To Providence? To the gods? To the fairies? Who am I thanking? Well, I want to turn finally to this rather strange question, because I think it bears upon another interesting question, which is why we have religion at all. That's a question that I, as a Darwinian, am often asked, because and I think it deserves an answer, because religion does appear to be a kind of human universal, in the sense that anthropologists tell us that all cultures that have been looked at have something equivalent to a religion. They're very different in detail, but they all seem to have it. Doesn't mean every individual has it, but in the same sense as you could say heterosexual desire is a human universal, even though not all individuals have it. In that sense, religion appears to be a human universal, and therefore it would seem to demand some sort of Darwinian explanation. Either religion has survival value, either religion makes individuals more likely to survive or perhaps more likely to reproduce, or perhaps a byproduct. Perhaps religion is a byproduct of some psychological predisposition which has Darwinian survival value. The kind of thing I'm suggesting there is that a psychological predisposition to, say, believe what your parents tell you, obey authority, believe tribal elders, that is what might have Darwinian survival value. And religious belief might be a kind of spin-off, a kind of byproduct of this psychological predisposition. Now that would be a more indirect, perhaps a more subtle way of answering the question, what is the survival value of religion? The answer is, it's not religion that has survival value, but it's a psychological predisposition that has survival value, and which incidentally produces religion under the right cultural circumstances. And I advanced that idea in my previous book, The God Delusion. But today I want to suggest to you a different kind of psychological predisposition, because I was never wedded to the idea that that particular one of believing authority was the only one. And this is where I want to try to explain this sort of abstract sense of gratitude that I feel and that I've been trying to instill in you for your own existence. I think it has its roots in our social evolution. We are an intensely social species. We cooperate in many different ways. Cooperation is vital to our survival. Once upon a time, each family pretty much fended for itself in a similar way. I don't know the details, but perhaps the man went out hunting while the woman stayed behind and hunted for berries and nuts and things like that. There was probably some barter and trade between families, but most families probably made their living in pretty much the same way as each other. Later on, there might have become specialists. Perhaps people settled down and started cultivating the land. Perhaps some individuals specialized in growing one kind of food, others specialized in growing another kind of food. And so trade grew up. Somebody who had a surplus of one thing but a shortage of the other traded it, vice versa. Perhaps later still, skills arose. Perhaps some people developed a skill which was nothing to do with growing food, but was useful to the people who grew food. Smiths arose, who were skilled with working with metal, and maybe their skills were useful to the farmers who were using digging spades or something like that to grow the food. So bartering gradually gave rise to a kind of need to reckon who owes what to whom. Money, of course, was the final token of this, and money could be thought of as growing out of IOU notes, growing out of the need to keep a record of who owes what to whom. What I'm suggesting is that whereas money nowadays has the advantage of being easy to count and keep track of, before money was invented, there was a need for something that we could call mental money. There was a need for an elaborate brain mechanism to calculate debt, calculate indebtedness, calculate who owes what to whom. The debt reckoning mental money machine in our ancestors' brain became complicated and sophisticated. All sorts of obscure details needed to be kept track of and put into the calculation. People didn't only need to keep track of what they owed to whom and how much was owed to them by whom. They also needed to watch other people, to keep track of who was a good person to strike a bargain with, who's the kind of person who normally does pay back his debts, who's the kind of person who is a useless, untrustworthy wastrel. In order to do all that, the brain needed to evolve, the brain did evolve, in my speculation, a mechanism for doing calculations. This may be where our ability to do mathematics of all other kinds came from originally. It was because of the need to keep track of debt. I think that's why we have such a strong sense of fairness and unfairness built into our brains, and it develops early. Children are obsessed with fairness. One of the commonest words you'll ever hear a child say is, "not fair." And they will say that even when the not fairness doesn't come from another human being, another child, but comes from outside. It's not fair that it rained on my birthday. That's the kind of thing you might hear a child say. And what I'm suggesting is that that is an example of the projection of calculations that are supposed to be made, that originally were made, for interactions between individuals, projecting outwards to the inanimate world where they are actually inappropriate. I think that we humans have this strong sense of fairness and unfairness, this strong sense of debt, of gratitude, of guilt, of indebtedness, of feeling debt owed to us. And it is so strong within us that, like sexual lust, we project it outwards to even when it may no longer be appropriate to its original biological function. Do we project sexual lust out beyond its original biological function? Well, yes, we do, because its biological function is quite clearly reproduction, and yet the lust is in no way diminished when we are using a contraceptive, and so we know perfectly well at a cognitive level that it is no longer performing its biological function. If what Darwinian natural selection built into us was a cognitive awareness of what we need to do in order to propagate our genes, then we would never copulate other than if we really were intending to have children. But of course that's not the way nature works. Nature builds into us a strong desire for sex, a lust, and that lust remains even when it is detached, in this case by contraception, even when it is detached from its biological function. The lust remains. And similarly, I think that there is a lust to be grateful, a lust to feel indebted, a lust to feel grudges towards those individuals who should have paid their debts and actually haven't. So that's what I'm suggesting, that my desire to feel gratitude for my existence and my desire to encourage you to feel gratitude for your existence is a kind of gratitude going off in a vacuum. It's an emotion that was once appropriate, indeed is appropriate, if we are grateful to other human beings, but that we generalize it, it goes off in a vacuum. This word vacuum is one that's a favorite word of ethologist, the student of animal behavior of the school to which I belong. Vacuum activity is when an animal does something which is part of its normal repertoire, but which is in a vacuum in the sense that it's not appropriate at the moment when it's being done. I've seen two very striking films of vacuum activities that I could tell you about. One was a film of a squirrel which would normally bury nuts underground, but this squirrel was in a bare cage without any earth, and so it was burying the nut, showing the motions of burying, but without any earth to do the burying. And I've seen my dog doing exactly the same thing, and it's a very endearing sight. A dog had a bone. There's the bone. And the dog was pushing the soil with its nose, exactly the way that it would do if there really was soil, and tamping it down with the snout. That's one vacuum activity that I've seen. Another vacuum activity, perhaps even more striking, is a captive beaver in a bare room with a concrete floor. Beavers, as you know, build dams, and it's a very intricate process, a very skilled process. It has a consequence, which is a long-term consequence, which is beneficial to the beaver. It makes a lake, and the lake is valuable to the beaver because it provides a safe waterway for the beaver to forage over, and it protects it from predators. There are lots of reasons why a lake is a good thing for a beaver to have. And so natural selection has favored those beavers that build dams because of the indirect long-distance consequence of dam building. Now, this beaver in a cage had no river to dam, it had no logs, it had no twigs, it had nothing in that cage, nothing in that room, just bare concrete. But it was going through the full motions of building a dam, picking up phantom logs, putting them in a phantom dam, shoving them in, adjusting them. That's a vacuum activity. And what I'm suggesting is that we are capable of feeling vacuum gratitude. That's what I feel for my own existence. And that, of course, is what we feel towards whichever God or gods we've been brought up to worship. We feel gratitude in a vacuum towards God. We feel gratitude, we feel guilt in a vacuum towards God. If something dreadful happens, if, say, a tsunami hits our village and destroys just about everybody, we feel, or not we feel, but some people feel, as you know, this must be a judgment from heaven. This must be because of sin. This must be because of licentiousness and strip bars in the town, that God sent an earthquake, God sent a tsunami. We can also feel gratitude in the wake of a disaster of that sort. When hundreds of thousands of people have died, as I think did happen in the terrible tsunami in Southeast Asia when was it, 2005, 2004? You would hear stories of people saying that their particular child had been thought lost and had turned up clinging to a piece of driftwood with nothing worse than a broken leg or something. They give thanks. They feel gratitude to God for saving this one child, when presumably he could have saved 100,000.